I ran into an old acquaintance the other day, someone who was the absolute definition of a 90s optimist. You know, the type.
Oh, yeah, I think we all knew someone like that.
Totally. Back then, he was completely all in. He'd talk your ear off about the end of history, about like McDonald's opening in Moscow and the digital Eden of the new internet, meaning we basically solved everything.
The future was bright, simple.
Exactly. The future for him was just this clean, globalized shopping mall stretching out forever. His confidence was, well, it was infectious. It was absolute. So you can imagine my surprise when I saw him last week. The relentless optimism was just gone. He pulled out his phone, but not to show me new market opportunities or anything.
What then?
He was showing me satellite maps of Arctic ice melt and drought charts. He started talking about the climate, but it didn't sound like science. You know, it sounded more like a sermon.
Right, that kind of apocalyptic tone.
Completely. He used words like inevitable, penitence, and total collapse, describing fires and floods with this almost theatrical gravity. It was like listening to someone describe the apocalypse of John, only, you know, with carbon emissions swapped in for the seven-headed beasts.
Wow, that's quite a shift.
It really was, that instantaneous shift from it's all one to it's all over. It was jarring. And it made me feel that for him, maybe it's just easier to imagine the entire cosmos ending in fire than it is to imagine a simple, kind of banal future where his world isn't the center of the universe anymore.
That's a powerful observation.
Well, that shift from the triumph of the end of history to this pervasive despair of total collapse, it really defines a certain prevailing mood in the West right now, doesn't it?
It really does.
The question at the heart of that personal story is kind of central to this deep dive we're doing. Why is it easier for some to imagine the end of the universe than the loss of their own centrality?
That is a compelling and I think deeply insightful observation because it captures a core psychological mechanism we see reflected in global politics. When an established order feels its foundations shaking, it doesn't just adapt, it secretes its own apocalypse myth.
Huh. An apocalypse myth.
Exactly. What you're witnessing in your acquaintance and across, media narratives is the phenomenon we call the narrative of the apocalypse of the golden billion.
Okay, define that term for us, the golden billion. What does that mean exactly?
Right. It's basically a descriptive term for that, let's say, narrow club of global power holders. Roughly 1 billion people concentrated in the US, Western Europe, Japan, and their closest allies. The nations that held global economic, technological, and military dominance for the last 2 centuries, give or take.
Got it. The traditional West, essentially.
Pretty much. And when this group senses its dominance receding, the narrative quickly shifts from, say, structural change and maybe relative decline to one of cosmic collapse. If we aren't in charge, the story goes, the world must be ending.
So the fear of decline gets repackaged.
Precisely. It gets conveniently repackaged as the fear of extinction. It's quite a move psychologically.
And that reframing shifts the focus away from, internal institutional failure or maybe necessary lifestyle changes onto this vast, insurmountable global fate.
Exactly right. And that framing the narrative of crisis and impending demise in the West provides the core contrast for our deep dive today. We're juxtaposing that narrative against societies that are not predicting the end, but are actively writing future plans. They're seeing opportunity, not just, ruin.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack that alternative. We're going deep into the stack of sources detailing China's multifaceted, future-oriented strategy in governance, economy, and technology. We're looking for the structural planning that exists entirely outside of, and often in counterpoint to, that prevailing narrative of Western crisis.
That's the plan, looking beyond the doom loop, so to speak.
Okay, let's pick up on that apocalypse myth concept. It's fascinating how consistent it seems to be across history. You mentioned that these grand narratives always seem to mask something much more mundane, often relating to the decline of a ruling class or maybe institutional failure.
It's an ancient pattern, really. Think about the historical example of ancient Rome, when early Christian communities composed texts like the Apocalypse of John. They described this terrifying cosmic drama, dragons, 7-headed beasts, fire from the heavens.
Right, the whole epic saga.
Exactly. But what was this grand theater masking? Well, it was the far more banal reality of the collapse of effective imperial administration. Citizens were suffering from, crippling taxes, corruption was rampant, legions were failing to stop incursions.
That's the system breaking down.
Pretty much. The text took the failure of a worldly power structure and transformed it into a cosmic drama. This gave the defeated a sense of, well, ultimate divine significance and eventual final victory. It's a coping mechanism in a way.
It provides comfort, yeah, but only by projecting the problem outward onto some grand stage. We certainly saw echoes of that during the 20th century, didn't we? The constant threat of nuclear apocalypse during the Cold War, the air raid sirens, the duck and cover drills. It maintained this illusion that the world was constantly on the brink.
But underneath all that performative fear, the balance of terror was actually, a highly stable, if frozen, geopolitical equilibrium. The fear itself was a political and psychological tool, really, used to maintain internal cohesion within the blocs. And we see that same pattern repeat. I mean, look at the myth of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that masked clear geopolitical interests. Or the 2008 financial crisis. It used the language of existential catastrophe to shield internal financial institutions from, frankly, necessary structural reform.
And the current climate crisis, which is, let's be clear, an undeniable and critical threat. But it functions similarly in the discourse of the Golden Billion sometimes, doesn't it? It often acts as this massive screen, deflecting attention from the core internal fear, the loss of the unsustainable, kind of unlimited Western lifestyle.
Exactly. It's somehow easier to accept the total end of civilization than to accept that an entire economic Model 1 built on, endless growth, cheap resources, maybe 3 cars per family, must radically change.
Right.
That necessary internal adjustment, which would mean sacrificing centrality and consumption, it's just too painful. So the narrative becomes cosmic and inevitable. And while the West is obsessing over this narrative of decline, the sources clearly show that other countries, particularly China and India, are operating with an entirely different clock. They're writing futures, not apocalypses.
They're building something else.
Precisely. This divergence, this contrast between reactive survival and proactive construction was perfectly captured in a story I heard from a German engineer, Marcus, working in the automotive sector in Bavaria. A highly regulated, complex industry there.
Okay.
He's been in the industry for decades. He recounted that back in the 90s, strategy meetings were all about global expansion, market optimization, growth.
Yeah.
Now, he says, every meeting is about survival. Surviving the energy crisis, surviving quarterly targets, surviving the next round of EU regulations. It's entirely reactive, focused just on the immediate threat.
That sounds utterly exhausting, just constantly navigating a state of threat.
It really does.
Yeah.
He then contrasted this with a recent call he had with his counterparts at a joint venture in Shanghai. He told me, I asked them about their 3-year forecast, trying to pin them down on immediate market volatility. He said, they laughed, literally laughed, and sent me their aligned industrial blueprint for 2035, which was tied directly to the national plan. Marcus felt he was just navigating this fog of immediate decline, constantly reacting to crises, while his Chinese colleagues were systematically building based on a comprehensive 50-year-plus map.
Wow.
It's a really powerful illustration of that divergence in strategic focus. One's putting out fires, the other's designing the city.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does this long view manifest domestically? That engineer's story about the 2035 blueprint perfectly illustrates how China operates through structural, long-term planning, particularly these 5-year plans.
Right. The 5-year plan system is really the engine of this forward-looking mindset. The current document is the outline of the 14th 5-year plan, covering 2021 to 2025. But, and this is key, this specific plan isn't just a standalone budget document.
It's up to something bigger.
Exactly. It's a critical step that sets the stage for the country's transformation into a modernized socialist nation, building systematically toward that ultimate centennial objective of 2049.
So the immediate 5-year targets are always contextualized within a much longer multi-decade vision. The 2035 long-range objectives must be the most revealing look at this long game then.
They absolutely are. Looking forward to 2035, the goal is explicitly stated as achieving total socialist modernization. The ambitions are laid out really clearly. A sharp rise in overall national strength, including economic and scientific prowess.
Right.
Crucially, the objectives state that the total economic output and the per capita income of urban and rural residents must reach new levels, and China must enter the first rank of innovation-oriented countries globally. This isn't just about catching up anymore.
No, it sounds like aiming for leadership, defining the frontiers.
That's the ambition. If that's the aspiration, then innovation and self-reliance have to be the primary driver of this entire plan. And it is. It's the absolute core focus. Science and technology, self-reliance, and self-improvement are explicitly listed as the strategic support for national development. The goal is to orient the country toward the world's cutting edge, reducing external dependence in critical sectors. And crucially, this focus isn't measured in, philosophical terms. It's very metric-driven.
Let's get into those specifics then. What are the key performance indicators that demonstrate this commitment to moving into the first rank of innovators by 2035?
Well, the numbers are designed to really shock the system into transformation. For the current 14th FYP period, the one ending in 2025, the target is for whole society R&D expenditure, that's research and development, to increase by more than 7% annually.
More than 7% annually. That's huge.
That's huge. That's a mandatory aggregate target. It means that in just 5 years, the total expenditure will be significantly higher than if they just maintained a stable rate. I mean, to put that 7% annual growth into context, most developed nations hover around, 2% to 3% annual growth in R&D, sometimes lower.
So China's mobilizing resources on a completely different scale.
An unprecedented scale, really, to ensure it owns the technologies of the future.
And the output metrics sound equally aggressive, aiming to nearly double the quality and quantity of innovation.
Precisely. They're targeting high-value invention patents per 10,000 people to increase from 6.3 to a specific target of 12 by 2025. This metric ensures the focus isn't just on filing any old patent, but on creating economically and strategically valuable intellectual property, real innovation.
And the plan meticulously details these cutting-edge S&T fields, showing direct state intervention aimed at solving strategic technological choke points. What specific areas are receiving the most concerted, directed investment here?
The list is basically a roadmap for future global competition. They detail breakthroughs needed in integrated circuits, so semiconductors, aiming for key design tools, critical equipment, and materials like wide bandgap semiconductors, things like silicon carbide, gallium nitride.
Which is a direct response to geopolitical pressure, right?
Yep.
Chip Acts.
Absolutely. This focus is a direct response to attempts to restrict China's access to high-end chips. It signals a long-term commitment to industrial self-sufficiency in computing. It's a defensive measure wrapped in a proactive development plan, if you like.
Okay. What about the fields that represent completely new frontiers, not just catching up, but leaping ahead?
Right. That brings us to new generation AI. Investment there targets dedicated AI chips and the construction of open source algorithm platforms, particularly deep learning frameworks. By building the fundamental infrastructure, the chips and the software platforms, they aim to control the foundational layers of future AI development.
Building the pipes, essentially.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
Furthermore, there's quantum information, focusing on developing general quantum computing prototypes and practical quantum simulators, which could completely redefine cryptography and computation down the line.
And beyond the digital, the plan includes biological and exploratory sciences, too.
Yes, absolutely. The focus on brain science and brain-inspired research is aimed at understanding the basis of cognitive function, which ties directly into future AI development, but also human-machine interfaces. And finally, there are these really ambitious exploration programs covering deep space, deep earth, deep sea, and polar exploration.
Wow.
Yeah, this involves major infrastructure, like developing a new generation of heavy lift launch vehicles and specific interstellar projects, like Mars orbiting and asteroid inspection. This is a comprehensive, technologically aggressive map designed to ensure China is not just reacting to crises, but leading and defining the technological boundaries of the world going forward.
Okay, so this impressive national planning isn't happening in a vacuum, is it? It entirely supports an outward-looking global vision. The domestic strength feeds the global strategy. And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. We need to discuss the foundational philosophy that guides China's external relations, the Global Community of Shared Future, or GCSF.
Right, the GCSF. It's far more than just a diplomatic slogan. It's really positioned as the comprehensive philosophical and strategic answer to that question the Golden Dilion seems to be struggling with. Where is humanity headed?
Right.
President Xi Jinping first propounded this idea about a decade ago, back in 2013. It's built on the premise that all human destinies are interconnected, and it advocates for building an open, inclusive, clean, and beautiful world that enjoys lasting peace, universal security, and common prosperity.
It sounds like a direct philosophical counterpoint to the entire Western liberal order that sort of defined the 20th century. What are the core distinctions being drawn there?
Well, the vision is explicitly defined in opposition to what Beijing sees as outdated geopolitical structures. It aims to rise above the exclusive rules of bloc politics, think NATO or the G7, and it rejects the notion that might makes right in international affairs. And critically, it challenges the idea of universal values defined by a handful of Western countries. Instead, it promotes common values for all humanity that respect the diversity of civilizations and political systems. That diversity piece is key.
So if the GCSF is the high-level blueprint, the big idea, what's the strategic framework for actually executing it? The sources point to China identifying 4 critical global deficits that need immediate resolution, leading to the creation of this global quartet of initiatives.
That's the actionable structure, exactly.
Right.
China identifies 4 major global deficits: the peace deficit, the development deficit, the security deficit, and the governance deficit. And to resolve these systemic holes, they put forward the 4 great global initiatives.
Okay, let's break down how the initiatives map onto those deficits, maybe starting with the biggest global challenge, development. How does that work?
Right, so the Global Development Initiative, GDI, tackles the development deficit. Its core mandate is to promote inclusive economic globalization, ensuring that modernization and progress are accessible to all countries, particularly in the Global South.
And the Belt and Road Initiative fits in here.
Absolutely. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, that massive global infrastructure project, is positioned as the single most critical, practical vehicle for achieving the GDI's goals on the ground. It's about linking infrastructure and trade networks globally to spread that development.
Okay. Then you have the Global Security Initiative, GSI, addressing the security deficit. And you mentioned this is where the diplomatic language gets perhaps sharpest.
It does get quite pointed. The GSI promotes a concept of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. Now, this specific phrasing is quite deliberate. It explicitly rejects unilateral action and the pursuit of their own so-called absolute security.
Which sounds like.
Well, when most analysts read that, they understand it as a poted but pretty direct rejection of U.S. security policy, the focus on unilateral dominance, using military blocs to enforce security interests, often at the expense of others' security.
Right.
The argument is that security must be shared and sustainable, or ultimately it's unattainable for anyone.
Okay. That brings us to the Global Civilization Initiative, GCI, and the peace deficit, which seems to relate directly back to the rejection of Western universal values you mentioned.
It does. The GCI is fundamentally about advocating respect for the diversity of world civilizations. It emphasizes that every nation has the right to choose its own path to modernization and governance without external interference.
Challenging the idea of one size fits all.
Precisely. It challenges that persistent Western tendency to measure every society against a singular political and economic model. It prioritizes the rights of countries to self-determination and their chosen systems taking precedence over, say, externally defined individual rights frameworks.
And finally, the Global Governance Initiative for the governance deficit. This sounds like a direct challenge to the existing world order.
It is the most direct confrontation, yes. This initiative seeks to resolve the perceived lack of equity and representation in global bodies by directly confronting Cold War mentality, hegemonism, and protectionism. The assertion here is that global governance is at a crossroads.
The transition point.
Exactly, where the world must transition toward a more democratic, multilateral Chinese vision that, in their view, better reflects the economic and demographic realities of the 21st century, not the post-WWII era.
That level of strategic intent, it sounds good as a high-level framework, but how does this actually translate into new models of cooperation on the ground? Ones that might bypass those old Western-centric structures?
Well, I think we need to look at how new global partnerships are actually functioning right now. I heard this anecdote from a high-level policy contact, someone who works in development based in Brussels. It perfectly illustrates this kind of sidestepping of old Western centrality.
Yep.
She was attending a multi-day climate finance summit. She noted that the first day, led entirely by traditional European and American institutions, was dominated by this sort of backward-looking anxiety. It was all about losing leadership, arguments over historical carbon debt, defending the existing rules of global governance. It felt like, in her words, a funeral for the 20th century.
Oof, gloomy.
Yeah. But then, the very next day, there was a completely separate forum hosted by new multilateral banks, including significant Chinese leadership. And the entire tone just shifted.
How so?
The discussion wasn't about blame for the past, but about deployment for the future. Things like shared platforms for green technology transfer, new financing models for African infrastructure that bypass typical IMF requirements, cooperation on practical industrial policy. My contacts said it was jarring.
A different energy entirely.
Completely. It wasn't some utopian vision, she stressed, but it was structurally forward-focused. It demonstrated a leadership willing to actually build a new era of cooperation, completely sidestepping the Western narrative that the end of its centrality means the end of the world.
So the emotional burden felt by that German engineer we talked about is being countered, in a way, with these new institutional alternatives. That new forum you mentioned, it's increasingly manifesting within platforms like BRICS, right?
That is the pivotal platform, yes. The BRICS bloc, now BRICS Plus, following the recent quite significant inclusion of Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. It's the key mechanism for this emerging economic order.
And that expansion fundamentally changes the math of global power, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's massive. BRICS Plus now represents, 45% of the world's population, controls something like 40% of global oil production, and generates about 28% of global GDP. This substantial demographic and economic weight gives the bloc significant leverage in shaping global trade, security, and especially financial arrangements. It poses a real structural challenge to the traditional Western financial dominance rooted in the Bretton Woods system.
And a key financial tool here is the New Development Bank, the NDB, which was explicitly created to rival institutions like the IMF and World Bank.
That's correct. The New Development Bank, established back in 2014 by the original BRICS members, was set up specifically to finance infrastructure and sustainable development projects. And critically, yes, it was designed as an alternative to Bretton Woods institutions, which are often criticized, rightly or wrongly, for attaching politically loaded conditionalities and imposing Western-centric economic reforms on borrowing nations.
What kind of capital has the NDB actually deployed so far? Is it making a dent?
Well, by 2022, the NDB had already allocated a substantial portfolio of $30.2 billion invested across 85 different ventures. These projects are directed toward tangible areas like renewable energy, water security, transportation, social infrastructure. This investment serves as a concrete mechanism for that global development initiative. We talked about funding projects that directly support the GCSF vision of common prosperity.
And China, being the largest economy of the bloc, is presumably using BRICS to push perhaps the most important financial agenda item, reducing global dependence on the U.S. dollar.
Absolutely. China is clearly leveraging BRICS to promote a truly multipolar world, and achieving that requires financial diversification away from the dollar. They're leading efforts to de-dollarize trade by advocating for the increased use of the Chinese yuan or, other local member currencies in bilateral trade agreements.
Right.
This coordination across major global economies, particularly bringing in large energy exporters like Saudi Arabia, is a very clear long-term strategic move aimed at shifting the global financial architecture away from unilateral Western control.
Now, while this vision of a cohesive, future-focused bloc is certainly powerful, such a large and diverse group must face considerable internal friction, geopolitical complexities. We should probably touch on that for a balanced view.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to be impartial here. Our sources confirm that achieving full cohesion within BRICS Plus it's a complex task. For instance, despite being allied within BRICS, there are still long-standing geopolitical and, frankly, territorial disputes that strain bilateral relations between China and India.
The border issues.
Exactly. And India has also exercised significant caution regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, often viewing it through the lens of China's expanding geopolitical influence in the region rather than purely as economic cooperation.
And the expansion itself must introduce new rivalries, particularly with the inclusion of major Middle Eastern powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Indeed. Integrating Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are, let's face it, historic regional rivals, introduces very complex security dynamics right into the heart of the bloc, especially concerning the Persian Gulf. Managing these competing interests and ensuring that collective economic goals remain prioritized over regional security concerns. Well, that requires highly sophisticated internal cohesion mechanisms.
A delicate balancing act?
Very much so. Analysts note that the success of BRICS Plus hinges not just on its impressive economic weight, but critically on its ability to navigate these deep-seated geopolitical fault lines among its members.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to what might be the most tangible area of action: environmental transformation. If the Western apocalypse myth, as we've discussed, is rooted in paralysis and the agony of inevitable decline, what China seems to be providing is a visible structural alternative maybe the ultimate antidote to that paralyzing eco-anxiety. So what does this all actually mean for the daily reality of global climate action?
It means that while one part of the world is agonizing over whether climate change can even be fixed, another part is simply deploying the technology required to change the future at an almost unimaginable scale. It's quite the contrast. I often reflect on how this contrast impacts younger generations. Imagine a young university student in the US, let's call her Sarah for a moment. Like many in the golden billion, she's perhaps overwhelmed by eco-anxiety, consuming media that predicts inevitable collapse, wildfires, resource wars. She's sort of trapped in that apocalypse narrative.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
So for a research project, maybe she starts looking into renewable energy supply chains and deployment, probably expecting to find more doom and gloom. Instead, she discovers the staggering data that while her own country is debating policy details, China is installing more solar capacity than the rest of the world combined.
Wow.
She reads about cities where 100% of the buses and taxis are electric. She sees data not about some abstract end of the world, but about the practical scaled deployment of sustainable technology happening now. For her, this information isn't just innovation, it's a vibrant structural alternative. It might be the first time she's seen a tangible, concrete commitment to building a shared future, offering a powerful counter-narrative to the paralysis she grew up with.
That structural commitment is definitely visible in the sheer scale and speed of China's renewable energy dominance, which, looking at the figures, is genuinely unmatched globally.
The figures really do demonstrate this focus. Back in 2020, China pledged to reach 1,200 gigawatts GW of renewables capacity by 2030. Now, that seemed incredibly ambitious at the time, but at its current pace, China is projected to meet that 2030 target by 2025, a full 5 years ahead of schedule. Furthermore, some projections suggest China could boast as much as 1,000 GW of solar power alone by the end of 2026. This scale of deployment is absolutely crucial for meeting global climate targets.
And the installation rate itself is accelerating exponentially, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just to quantify that acceleration, in 2022, China installed roughly the same amount of solar capacity as the rest of the world combined. Then, in 2023, it doubled its new solar installations and increased new wind capacity by 66%.
Doubled it in 1 year.
Doubled it. This massive shift is transforming the power sector balance domestically. A decade ago, fossil fuels accounted for about 2/3 of China's power capacity. Today, they make up less than half of the total installed generation capacity. That signals a fundamental structural change in energy input capacity.
But the strategic impact goes far beyond just domestic capacity, right? China's long-term planning seems to have granted it near total control over the global clean energy supply chain.
That strategic foresight is a key component of its global influence, no question. Targeted strategic investments made since the mid-2000s were aimed not just at internal use, but explicitly at dominating global manufacturing in these key sectors.
And the result?
The result is that China now holds over 80% of the world's solar manufacturing capacity. It also controls the crucial processing of rare earths and strategic minerals essential for battery storage, electric motor components, the whole ecosystem.
And this industrial dominance, somewhat ironically perhaps, has actually served as a global catalyst for adoption, especially in developing nations, which ties back to that global development initiative you mentioned.
It really has. The sheer scale and efficiency of China's manufacturing output have drastically driven down prices worldwide for solar panels and wind turbines. This lowers the cost barrier significantly for rapid adoption by poorer countries that might otherwise be locked into expensive, polluting fossil fuel dependency for decades.
So it's practical development assistance through market forces.
In a way, yes. This dynamic is a powerful extension of the GDI. And this technological leadership isn't just limited to power generation. Let's not forget, BYD is now the world's biggest EV manufacturer, solidifying China's global lead in electric transportation too.
This action, again, it seems directly tied back to the high-level planning we discussed in segment 1. What are the specific emissions reduction goals stated in the 14th five-year plan?
The goals are encapsulated in what they call the 1+N policy system, which aims for peak carbon emissions before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. The 14th five-year plan translates this into specific mandatory targets for the 2021-2025 period.
Like what?
It's like a 13.5 8% reduction in energy consumption per unit of GDP, and a highly specific 18% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP. These are mandatory national goals applied across every sector.
And the infrastructure needed to actually support this transformation must be monumental. We're talking about building entire new regional energy systems, connecting them up.
Oh, the desert energy projects alone are just staggering in scale. China is planning to build over 200 large-scale clean energy bases. These are vast wind and solar farms, primarily in the western desert regions, which are resource-rich but geographically distant from the big industrial eastern markets.
So how do they connect them?
They'll be connected by new high-speed, ultra-high voltage transmission lines. The ultimate objective is raising total renewables capacity to about 3.9 terawatts by 2030. This scale of coordinated, national-level infrastructure building is really the definition of that future-writing mindset we've been discussing.
Okay, this sounds incredibly ambitious, almost too good to be true in some ways. We must address the complexity here. Despite this massive installed capacity, our sources point out a significant structural challenge. China still generates a disproportionate amount of its actual electricity from fossil fuels, mainly coal.
That is a critical point, and it requires a nuanced perspective, it's true. Despite having the largest installed renewable capacity globally by far, China still generates about 70% of its actual electricity from fossil fuels.
So the generation doesn't match the capacity.
Exactly. This means that actual renewable energy use is lagging significantly behind the installed capacity being built. There's a gap.
Why the lag? Is it purely political will? Or is it more of a structural grid problem? How does that work?
It's really a combination of both, heavily influenced by historical structure and, frankly, inertia. The existing utility grids were optimized over decades for high-speed transmission from large, reliable, centralized coal plants. Integrating highly variable, renewable power like wind and solar, which aren't always on, is technically complex. It requires massive investment in energy storage and much smarter transmission systems.
And there's the security aspect, too.
Absolutely. Anxiety over energy security reinforced by geopolitical tensions and, more recently, severe droughts that impacted hydropower output means that energy reliability often still equals coal in the minds of many regional planners. This political economy of coal, this ingrained reliance, has actually led to a recent surge in new coal plant permits, which seems to contradict the central government's pledge to strictly limit coal growth.
So it's a classic conflict between security imperatives and sustainability targets.
Precisely. It's a major internal contradiction they have to resolve.
So how does the national planning address this deep structural and political problem? Because simply building more solar panels isn't enough if the system can't effectively use them, right?
Right. The plan does recognize that power system reform is long overdue. The fundamental solution proposed is structural. China has announced detailed plans to create a unified national power market by 2030.
A single national grid.
Essentially, yes. This process involves merging the various regional grids into one nationwide system. Now, if successfully implemented, and it's a huge if, a massive undertaking, a unified market would allow for significantly better management of that intermittent renewable supply. It could maximize the use of that enormous 3.9 terawatt clean energy capacity by routing power efficiently from the resource-rich remote west to the big consumption centers in the east. It's a difficult, decade-long reform aimed squarely at solving that inherent contradiction.
Okay. Moving beyond the energy sector for a moment, China's commitment to building a shared future also seems evident in its global contributions in areas like health and technology governance, linking back to that GCSF philosophy.
Absolutely. In health, for example, particularly during the acute phases of the COVID-19 pandemic, China proposed building a community of health for all. This commitment translated into concrete action through a pioneering role in the equitable distribution of vaccines, providing support and medical aid to over 150 countries.
Right.
China was also among the first major nations to commit to supplying COVID-19 vaccines as a global public good, which demonstrated a commitment to global health equity, at least rhetorically and often practically.
And in the rapidly evolving realm of digital governance, cyberspace, what initiatives are they championing there?
Well, China is actively promoting the concept of a community of shared future in cyberspace. This involves supporting a UN-led global governance system rather than one dominated by individual nation-states or blocs. Key initiatives here include the Global Data Security Initiative, which aims to develop a common set of rules for global digital governance.
Trying to set standards.
Exactly, and ensuring that the interests and expectations of developing countries are fully reflected when formulating new rules for governance in new frontiers like outer space or the deep sea. It's about shaping the rules of the future.
And finally, we saw the commitment to climate South-South cooperation mentioned earlier as a way to spread green development models, reinforcing their role as a leader, or at least a key partner, for the Global South.
That South-South cooperation is highly significant, yes, and it demonstrates practical commitment outside of just financial mechanisms. China has signed, I think the number is 46 cooperation documents with developing countries specifically to address climate change.
And training, too.
Yes. Crucially, they have trained approximately 2,300 officials and technical personnel in climate change management for over 120 developing countries. This active technical support demonstrates a proactive role in helping the Global South achieve green and low-carbon development, reinforcing its global leadership role in climate action, which is entirely consistent with the GDI's goal of common prosperity. #tag outro. So when we pull back, our deep dive today really reveals this profound ideological and strategic divergence, doesn't it? The Western apocalypse myth, fed by endless crises, reinforced by media narratives, it's fundamentally a narrative of self-preservation, you could argue. It's like a massive theatrical mask that covers the deep institutional difficulty of accepting lost global centrality, and, maybe more importantly, the painful necessary shift away from a highly unsustainable economic model.
Yeah. The contrasting reality, as detailed in the sources we looked at, is one of long-term structural planning. China's vision seems built on massive technological deployment, encapsulated in these detailed, measurable 5-year plans, and it's supported by a proactive, outward-looking strategic vision, the global community of shared future and that global quartet of initiatives.
Right. Platforms like BRICS and the New Development Bank, they aren't waiting around for the traditional system to fail or reform itself. They appear to be proactively constructing a future based on shared risk, shared benefit, and multilateral cooperation, albeit on their own terms.
It seems the rest of the world, or large parts of it anyway, is not waiting for the meteorite, as my acquaintance feared.
No. They appear to be building the future with a comprehensive map in hand, focusing on specific, measurable targets for technological innovation, governance reform, and global industrial shifts.
The challenge, then, for those accustomed to seeing their own story as the story of humanity, is that the end of their dominant order doesn't necessarily signal the end of the world. It merely marks the beginning of a different, already planned chapter.